It was arguably the most important foreign policy decision of President Obama's first term. Now, new data suggests that the Afghan surge has been a military failure. You're watching Inside Story US 2012 from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. With just over a month until the general election, the US military has withdrawn the last of the 33,000 troops President Obama sent to Afghanistan in December of 2009. But according to data released by the NATO command in Afghanistan, or ISAF, obtained by Wired magazine, the Taliban's momentum is fiercer now than before the surge. Insurgent attacks may be lower than last year, but they're significantly higher when compared to 2009, before the surge was launched. And the number of civilian casualties caused by insurgent attacks in August of 2012 was the highest for 3 years. The surge was presented as the culmination of President Obama's careful deliberation, a sign of the qualities he brought to his role as Commander-in-Chief. That the decision has so little to show for the cost in lives and money should therefore be a major issue on the campaign trail. But with Mitt Romney seemingly loath even to mention Afghanistan, it is not. And beyond a vague promise to withdraw American troops by the end of 2014, neither the president nor Mitt Romney seems to have any clear vision for the future. NATO's lack of confidence in the Afghan forces that were meant to be strengthened by the surge was made abundantly clear when the US temporarily scaled back joint operations earlier this month after a string of so-called green-on-blue attacks. Operations did resume on Thursday, but with far stricter safeguards in place. So, has the surge been a failure? Joining me now, Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, a former US intelligence officer who served 2 combat tours in Afghanistan, Francis Brown, International Affairs Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and Gareth Porter, investigative reporter and historian. Let's begin with some of these figures from the ISAF monthly data document that we've just got our hands on then, the trends through August 2012, beginning with their figures on enemy-initiated attacks. In August of 2009, when the Obama administration was debating the need for a troop surge, Taliban and allied fighters attacked US-led forces about 2,700 times. The number of attacks approached its peak near 4,500 in August of 2010. And then here are the latest figures. Clearly there is a reduction from the height of the surge, but still substantially more attacks than before the surge began, when it was felt action had to be taken. It should also be noted, actually looking at that graph, that the official analysis is that enemy-initiated attacks decreased 5% between January and August of 2012 compared to the same period in 2011. I mean, that's the official headline on the ISAF monthly data. However, clearly, when you look at before the surge and after, I guess that seems to be the more pertinent distinction to draw. I mean, beginning with that, Lieutenant Shaffer, well, what do you make of that?
Well, I make of it what we've talked about at my think tank from day one of the surge. All we've been doing is adding fiction to the friction. There's no actual achievable objectives within the military context of this effort. Let me be very clear on this. President Obama said his objective was to essentially stop the momentum of the Taliban and find a way to continue the efforts against al-Qaeda. Well, first off, al-Qaeda has long since been out of Afghanistan. They've been vanquished for years. Secondly, the whole idea of trying to resolve this militarily is folly. The real issues here is something that this administration has never been able to grasp. It's all about the ideology. It's all about the tribal nature of the environment. And because they've never grasped that, they've continued to use Western I would say almost a mythology of this counterinsurgency strategy without understanding what they're actually going to try to achieve and what's sustainable.
Well, I mean, let's look at another metric
Sure.
from that report then. The number of what the military calls executed improvised explosive device attacks. Yes. In August of 2009, fighters used under 600 homemade bombs targeting US allied forces. Such attacks approached a high of nearly 800 in July of 2011. The figures were just over 600 in August of this year. The US-led ISAF says that such attacks have fallen again from last year's highs, but once again you make that comparison between before the surge and things appear worse. Gareth Porter, I suppose also we have the increase in civilian casualties as well now being caused by insurgents post the surge. What do you make of all that?
Well, those things are linked,
yes.
And the reason they're linked, that is the increase in civilian casualties, which are overwhelmingly, of course, almost entirely from improvised explosive devices, IEDs. And that is linked, in fact, to the overall response of the Taliban to the surge in US and NATO troops. And the fact is that the Taliban has been able to vastly increase the number of IED attacks that are effective in causing casualties on the part of the foreign troops in Afghanistan. And if you look at the figures for actual casualties from those attacks, you know, it's really quite dramatic. It was only something like 270 wounded in 2008. Then in 2009, it went all the way to 1,100 some, and it tripled then to 3,300 some in 2010, and remained even higher, went higher slightly to 3,500 in 2011. So in fact, this is a dramatic, not just an illustration, but central to the inability of the US surge to not just reverse the momentum, but to stop the momentum.
Well, and staying with this, the military side of this, then, of the surge and the momentum of the Taliban, Francis Brown, is that a little unfair? I mean, many do say quite often that there was some progress, particularly in the south, for example, where life did appear to become returning to normal. How do we square those claims with the sort of figures that we have from ISAF's own findings?
Well, I'll certainly leave the questions of security attacks to the security experts. I would say counterinsurgency is also, as we know, a struggle for governance, a contest for governance. In that regard, I would say that we did see a lot of localized tactical level progress on the governance fronts, in the development front. We did see civilians coming to their local government officials for services, particularly in the South, in a way that was not previously seen. I would say the jury is very much out whether that localized tactical progress will equate to a strategic level game change.
Well, we'll develop those thoughts in a minute, because you've just come out with quite an extensive report on this issue, so we'll develop some of those thoughts in a moment. But before we get onto that, then, just to return to the military side of this, this calm in the south, then, and indeed the training of Afghan forces is the other issue as well. And even supporters of President Obama's tactics are beginning to realize that perhaps even the metrics on Afghan training are a bit suspect, because the people now adjudicating whether brigades are combat ready or independent are actually the same people training them now. They're no longer independently being adjudicated and so forth. But how is that all going, and how do we explain then these oases in the south?
Well, let me hit those 3 points real quick. First, on the training, the cornerstone of the strategy, military strategy, is now in a shambles. Michele Flournoy says it's a tiny, tiny, tiny minority. I don't buy that.
Actually, before you go, we have what Michele Flournoy had to say.
Oh, good.
Because it was very striking, and
it was very striking.
A key advisor to President Obama right now. Let's hear what she had to say.
Of the literally thousands and thousands of interactions we have every day with Afghan forces, these very occasional blue, green on blue violence incidents of Afghans firing against coalition forces are, fractions of 1% of in terms of the number of incidents in the whole of the interactions. And they are also a sign of, I believe, Taliban desperation.
So these are the last gasps, then?
The desperation is from Ms. Flournoy and the administration, not from the Taliban. Let me be very clear on this. Ryan Crocker just said in an interview a few minutes ago, was just put out.
Former ambassador.
Former ambassador Ryan Crocker, who was there. She wasn't. He says the infiltration is 25% or more. He says more than 25%. He's there, she's not. She's a bureaucrat.
Sorry, Taliban into ISAF.
Into
forces.
ISAF, and into the NATO-led training effort, the new ANA, the Afghan military forces, and the police. With that said, then, if that's the cornerstone, I don't think the cornerstone is going to be stable enough to hold the overall effort. Other mistakes, very quick. We told the Taliban where we're going, 5 provinces essentially, and yes, wherever we went, wherever we stood, wherever we did physically, it made progress. And then other places we neglected, things backslid. And ultimately, you have a zero-sum game. Nothing was gained, nothing was lost except American blood. Let me be very clear on this. We invested a lot in this, and yet somehow we've not been able to overcome it. So in the end, militarily, as a military expert, having been there twice, this has not done anything to help make one of the objectives, the Afghan people more secure, as Gareth talked about. One of the objectives was to make the Afghan people more secure so they could have good governance. We have not done that.
Gareth, when you hear Michele Flournoy saying things like that, it does remind me of that report that came out by Lieutenant Colonel David Davis earlier this year, it was an astonishing report.
Danny Davis. Right?
Danny Davis,
yes,
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Who said that US military leaders are basically distorting the truth quite. In fact, there's some even coalition partners, and I wonder whether they realize they're distorting the truth. So they're so committed to this narrative.
Yeah, I mean, this is important to understand. I think what Danny Davis has pointed out privately is that you have a situation where there is that generals in Kabul have been actually discouraging intelligence officers from telling stories or giving news that is not in line with the narrative of success for ISAF. So, I mean, there is a systematic dynamic here that weeds out from the official reporting to Washington from the higher levels in the U.S.
You better
NATO command.
remind us what Danny Davis's credentials are in giving this
Well,
assessment.
he was in Afghanistan as a lieutenant colonel, traveled thousands and thousands of miles all over the country and spoke with hundreds of U.S. troops and officials to find out what was really going on there.
Right.
So he has the greatest credibility imaginable.
And I guess that assessment might become useful when we get later on in the discussion when we ask what exactly is going on in the Obama administration as regards Afghanistan. But Francis Brown, then you have now, I mean, the surge was about more than about security and military strategy and so forth. It was about governance. You've just come out with that report. Some very interesting findings, the first of which was there was an overestimation of the link between amassing security effects and amassing governance effects. Explain that one in a nutshell, because it seems quite crucial.
Sure, yeah. As those of us who have tried to build governance and development on the ground know, building governance isn't an 18-month plan or certainly not a 6-month plan. It's a decades-long, generations-long undertaking. And so any surge campaign plan that was predicated on the idea that we could go in and clear and then immediately after that hold and build in a sustainable way wasn't really realistic. In actuality, of course, these are longer processes and longer term, and really we need to look forward. Will these processes hold going forward?
Right, and another interesting point that you discovered was there was an assumption that governance will bring stability when actually in some parts of Afghanistan it's precisely the intrusion of central governance and in fact attendant ISAF forces that are the factors that are creating the instability.
Yeah, I mean, Afghanistan is an extremely varied country and there's a lot of different attitudes. I think we sometimes assumed that bringing in services would automatically win over hearts and minds, when in reality sometimes just the intrusion of any outsiders, particularly an Afghan government who is viewed locally as corrupt, actually was destabilizing.
Is there any way, though, that you could come to the conclusion that as bad as things are now, they're still better than they may have been had Obama either not done anything in 2009 or begun the withdrawal of troops in 2009?
On the governance side, I think that actually the most relevant question is not 2012 now versus 2009. It's really 2009 versus what 2015 will look like, and can this progress hold in the long term? And I think the jury is very much out on whether or not on the governance side this progress can be held, and truly that comes down to the Afghan government at the central level making the needed reforms to do that.
I suppose what's interesting, again, in an election year when we're trying to judge President Obama's record as Commander-in-Chief, many of these issues were pointed out at the time when he was making these deliberations. And even under General Petraeus' own counterinsurgency strategy, even if you believe that was possible in Afghanistan, it never really kind of linked up with 1 to 50 ratio. You need 600,000 troops in an indefinite time period and so forth. So again, Gareth, I mean, you were very much reporting quite a bit in those days. Remind us then of the deliberations and how they came to this conclusion and what it tells us about President Obama as a Commander-in-Chief, I guess.
Well, first of all, of course, we know the military wanted at least 40,000 more troops, maybe a lot more than 40,000 more troops to be sent to Afghanistan in 2009, 2010. The question is whether, even if they'd gotten the additional troops that they asked for, would it have made any difference? It seems to me the figures that we've just been talking about, the number of wounded that the Taliban were able to impose on the United States through IED attacks, and that's only a part of the overall tally of casualties to the United States, but a very important part, that it tripled within that year, 2009 to 2010. That suggests to me that even with 50,000, 60,000, 70,000 more troops, ultimately it would not have prevented the Taliban from having been able to maintain the kind of strength that they now have shown that they can maintain, even despite the worst the U.S. was able to throw at them. Right. So I think that, in fact, whether the president was right or wrong to send 40,000 more or 35,000 more rather than the 70,000 that or 75, 80,000 that were requested or wanted by the military, it wouldn't have made any difference ultimately. And I think that that really is where the decision-making process broke down, the inability to understand that we're up against a Taliban adversary here, which is so resourceful and so intelligent in terms of being able to plan how to respond to the surge in multiple ways, in layered multiple ways, not just the IED attacks, but the insider attacks, which ultimately became the straw that broke the camel's back in a way, and as well the spectacular attacks such as they mounted against Camp Bastion in Kandahar about 10 days or so ago, 2 weeks or so ago, which showed that they're able to actually penetrate a major U.S. air compound and destroy 6 Harrier jets and kill 14 American or NATO servicemen, as well as a lieutenant colonel. So, I mean, this is the kind of attack that the Vietnamese were never able to mount during the height of the Vietnam War. I think it's very impressive.
Speaking of that, one of the things he was advised against, which he did anyway, was something called incrementalism, which is one of the things that failed in Vietnam. If you want to get ahead of the enemy, you got to surge past them. This was not a surge. Gareth is completely correct about the number of troops. I said you got to go big and go home on another network. Going big was 500,000 troops for 10 years.
Which is never going to happen.
Never going to happen. And 10 years, as pointed out, there's an overlap there with the governance. We've never talked before, by the way. And that 10-year term of time was very important to the process.
Right. So it was basically an entirely flawed strategy, which many people could see. This isn't an issue. I mean, clearly President Obama is very weak on this issue, and this isn't an election year. It isn't being discussed by Romney. Is that simply because what is the Republican position right now on all this? Well,
I wish I knew. I meet with Republicans a lot on this, as Gareth knows. I'm a conservative, and I think there's a real dearth of understanding in many ways by the conservative side, to include the Romney folks. I can tell you that I've talked to some of the Romney folks about their perspective. Chris Lehman, John Lehman, 2 of his advisors. I've given them my best estimate of what we should do, what the mistakes were made, but I don't know what the policy is going to be.
What's their reaction?
Well, I think everybody is trying to assess what's best, and to be totally blunt about this, the biggest concern is the economy right now. So I think that a lot of
this is connected to the economy.
Oh, I believe it is completely by the fact we've spent billions of dollars. We're talking about still, if we go with the Obama plan of 10 years more, Congress, one of the things that Congress is worried about. They have never even had any inkling.
Well, I mean, that's also an interesting point, because on the election trail, President Obama still presents this as a withdrawal in 2014, but of course, as far as we can tell, he does intend to have 20,000 troops for at least another 10 years. Is that correct, Gareth?
Certainly he expects to have special operations forces, certainly more than 10,000.
And private security contractors.
And private security contractors, as well as some trainers representing the Army itself. So, I mean, the question is, what is the calculation at this point about why there's any belief that that's conceivably feasible? Why aren't they now at the negotiating table saying, let's make a deal right now and let's shorten this process?
But if this was an election issue, what would the response be from the 3 of you then to people saying, someone challenging President Obama by saying, well, we should move forward the date of departure for as many troops as possible beyond, the withdrawal should really begin now?
It's been suggested to me that part of the problem here, if not the major problem, is both parties are so compromised by their position on Afghanistan, as they were on Iraq, that it's very, very difficult to turn these ships around and get either party to say it's time to get out.
I think I agree with Gareth completely on that. I don't think it's a right or left issue at this point. I think it's a point of where you have elements of both the left and the right, see things completely differently within their own parties.
But Francis Brown, from a point of view of someone who's studying, or at least hoping that any gains that have been made in governance are kept, are these relevant discussions to be having? What impact would it have if the withdrawals, if a hard withdrawal began now, for example?
Yeah, I think I can't really weigh in on the impact of a military withdrawal. I'm not a military expert. I will say that in the medium and long term, the governance and development challenge needs a longer term commitment, and I think the Obama administration has actually made great steps towards moving that along, signing the strategic partnership agreement. I haven't seen
Is this reliant on an overwhelming military presence now to remain until 2014?
The governance and development angle could be manifested any number of ways. It does not actually depend on the huge military footprint. I leave that to the planners. I will say I haven't seen any comprehensive response from the Romney campaign on sort of how that would be enabled.
In the meantime, 2 more years of billions of dollars being spent, more and more people being killed, and there's no apparent justification then in that case. I'm just asking. I'm asking the question there. I mean, it does sound rather shocking in an election year that that's not being.
Well, there is no comprehensive strategy that I can see, and I've studied this for a while.
You know, part of the problem seems to me, Shihab, is that in this country, the news media coverage of Afghanistan has never fully reflected the extremely heavy cost to American troops of this war.
There's certainly a lot of talk about American troops.
They talk about the number of deaths, but hardly ever about the number of wounded, which of course is more than 10 times.
I meant on the election trail, the candidates do express their fealty to American troops and their loyalty.
Of course, but I don't think that they ever really fully reflect or capture the heavy toll that this has taken in terms of injuries, wounds.
But Gareth, if you were challenging President Obama as a presidential candidate, what prescription would you be suggesting then? What would
I would certainly be saying that there's no excuse for not having yesterday, the day before, last year, or the year before that, having gone to the Taliban and said, let's make a deal based on a timetable for withdrawal. Let's, as part of the deal, have a ceasefire and some kind of process which will be involved with the Taliban versus the present government talking around a table about the political future.
Would that be your prescription for stability for local governance in Afghanistan in the long term?
I think, you know, in the medium and long term, the Obama administration has moved forward the plan of reconciliation, and that's, I think, those efforts are ongoing. We can't always know what's going on in those efforts. That's probably for the best.
And what about all the other factors, Lieutenant Colonel Pakistan, the other regional actors and so forth, which people again have been talking about for years, even before the surge, that perhaps this was the way forward.
Well, I can tell you for a fact that Pakistanis are very concerned. That is something that goes without having to be said. With that said, I think a lot of our military leaders have used the Iraq model, thinking that the Afghan model would follow. And I think that's part of the problem with Trace and these other folks. They somehow thought, this worked there, it'll work there. Not remotely.
Did they really? Again, this is the Danny Davis point, wasn't it? But I mean, because clearly even we were discussing how different the surge was and how many factors were involved in the surge in Iraq than it was in...
And the Afghan people are not ungoverned, they're self-governed. And we completely blew that away. And the other thing is the fact that most Afghan males cannot read or write. So the idea of building a 21st century military within this very constricted time was obviously insane as far as I'm concerned from its face. Good governance is ultimately the way I talk about in my book Operation Dark Heart, the Northern Ireland style peace process being the ultimate path here, because the military, we can meet military objectives on the ground all day, but that ultimately will not stop the conflict. The conflict has to be ended through governance, through some level of...
But you don't think it's already too late? I mean, there was a report that came out for the Carnegie Endowment this month, which said basically, let's face it, the regime in Kabul is going to collapse pretty soon. And perhaps it's too late now for the US to use its strategic powers perhaps in the region now, because it has blundered so much so far already.
I think it is. I think it's too late. And I think that the best you can hope for from negotiations is an exit strategy, which can, make some kind of contribution to a peace process that staves off as much as possible what looks like a coming civil war between Tajiks and other non-Pashtun ethnic groups in the north, particularly based in the north, and the Pashtun-based Taliban in the south. and the East. It seems inevitable that there is going to be a period of conflict which will continue once the Americans are out of there. I don't think anyone really expects that that's completely avoidable, but the United States should do everything possible to minimize the damage that's done.
Gareth Porter, thank you very much. Francis Brown, thank you. Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, thank you as well. And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.